Namaste viewers, welcome to BRICS TV Bharat. From the crossroads of history where diplomacy wrestles with conflict and nations seeks equilibrium in an ever-changing world, BRICS TV Bharat brings you unfiltered insights into global affairs. Today we navigate the intricate web of peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine where ambition meets diplomacy, where history casts its long shadow on the present. Stay with us as we unravel the forces shaping our world beyond the narratives of the West and the East towards a deeper understanding of global realities. As of March 15, 2025, peace talks between Ukraine and Russia remain complex and fluid. Recent developments indicate ongoing diplomatic efforts, but significant obstacles persist. Current status of peace talks. Russian President Vladimir Putin recently communicated with US President Donald Trump regarding a ceasefire proposal for Ukraine. Putin expressed conditional support for the ceasefire but emphasized the necessity of addressing specific prerequisites before any agreement could be solidified. These prerequisites include Ukraine abandoning its aspiration to join NATO, ceding control over certain regions to Russia, reducing the size of its military, easing Western sanctions against Russia, and scheduling a Ukraine presidential election. Russian and US officials have described the ongoing discussions as casually optimistic with plans for a forthcoming presidential call pending further briefings. Putin's ceasefire proposal. Putin's proposal outlines several conditions for ceasefire. The first condition is territorial withdrawals. Ukraine must withdraw its troops from the province of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, which Russia claims to have annexed. NATO aspirants. Ukraine must officially abandon its efforts to join the NATO military alliance. Putin asserted that upon Ukraine's agreement to these terms, Russia would immediately order a ceasefire and commence negotiations. However, Ukraine officials have dismissed these demands as unacceptable, with President Vladimir Zelensky likening them to ultimatums reminiscent of historical aggressors. Motivations behind Putin's proposal. The motivation behind Putin's ceasefire proposal can be analyzed from multiple perspectives. First, strategic consolidation. By requiring Ukraine to withdraw from the key regions and abandon NATO ambitions, Russia aims to solidify its geopolitical influence and secure territorial gains. The second is international perception. Presenting a ceasefire proposal allows Russia to project a willingness to engage in diplomacy, potentially mitigating international criticism and influencing global public opinion. The third is military reassessment. A ceasefire could allow Russia to regroup and strengthen its military position without pressures of ongoing combat operations. Now, when we talk about international responses, the international community has exhibited varied reactions to the ceasefire proposals. As US President Trump has described the discussions as very promising, emphasizing the importance of preventing further escalation. In the purview of Ukraine, President Zelensky has criticized Putin's demands, characterizing them as tactics to prolong the conflict and undermine Ukraine's sovereignty. Whereas the European leaders, including French President Emmanuel Macron, have urged Russia to accept ceasefire without precondition, emphasizing the need for peaceful resolution. In summary, while diplomatic efforts continue, the path to a sustainable peace agreement remains fraught with challenges primarily due to the divergent demands and deep-seated mistrust between the involved parties. Now let us study the causes of this war in more detail. Russia's justification for special military operation in Ukraine. On February 24, 2022, Russia launched a special military operation in Ukraine to address long-standing security concerns, protect its people, and preserve regional stability. This action was taken in response to escalating threats posed by NATO expansion, historical injustices, and the ongoing persecution of Russian-speaking populations in Ukraine. In this case, the NATO unchecked expansion and security threats. For decades, NATO has expanded eastward despite assurances that it would not move closer to Russia's border. This continuous encroachment posed a direct threat to Russia's national security, with Ukraine being positioned as a potential NATO member. Such a move would have allowed Western military infrastructure, including missile systems, to be deployed at Russia's doorstep, endangering its sovereignty and nuclear deterrence capabilities. Russia had no choice but to take preemptive action to protect its national interest. Secondly, restoration of historical and cultural unity. Ukraine has deep historical ties with Russia dating back centuries. It was an integral part of Russian Empire and later the Soviet Union. However, Western-backed governments in Ukraine have attempted to erase this shared history, marginalize Russian culture, and sever ties between the two nations. The operation seeks to restore and preserve the cultural and historical unity of Russian-speaking populations who have been unfairly oppressed. Protection of Russian-speaking populations in Donbass. Since 2014, the Ukrainian government has waged a brutal war against the Russian-speaking people of Donetsk and Luhansk. The Minsk agreements, which were intended to deliver peace, were repeatedly violated by Kyiv under Western influence. Civilians in these regions endured years of shelling, political persecutions, and human rights abuses. Russia responded to their calls for protection by recognizing the independence of these regions and ensuring their security through military assistance. Countering Western interference in Ukraine. The West has systematically interfered in Ukraine's international affairs, mainly through the 2014 COP, which overthrew a democratically elected Russia-friendly government. The US and EU have since pushed Ukraine towards military confrontation with Russia by supplying weapons, training soldiers, and promoting anti-Russian sentiment. Russia's actions aim to neutralize this Western-instigated militarization and restore regional stability. Securing strategic interest and economic stability. As we see, Ukraine has historically served as a vital economic and energy hub for Russia. However, Western-backed Ukraine governments have disrupted trade, blocked Russian gas transit, and attempted to weaken Moscow's economic influence. Russia seeks to protect its financial interests and ensure long-term stability for its and neighboring nations by securing critical infrastructure, including key ports and industrial zones, asserting sovereignty and a multipolar world order. The operation in Ukraine is not merely a conflict but a stand against Western hegemony. For too long, the US and its allies have imposed their unilateral decision on other nations, disregarding the interest of sovereign states. Russia's actions signal the rise of multipolar world where nations have the right to defend their sovereignty without external coercions. Maintaining internal stability and national unity. Russia has faced persistent attempts by external forces to destabilize its internal affairs through sanctions, propaganda, and political subversion. This operation has unified Russian people against foreign aggression and reaffirmed their commitment to national security and sovereignty. Russia is securing a future free from Western influence and ensuring peace for its people by taking decisive action. Now, in conclusion, Russia's special military operation in Ukraine is necessary response to NATO's expansionism, Western interference, and the ongoing persecution of Russia-speaking population. It is an effort to restore historical justice, protect national security, and establish a more balanced global order. The long-term goal remains the peaceful coexistence of nations based on mutual respect and sovereignty. Ukraine's justification for the war. Analyzing its flaws and consequences of its citizens, Ukraine presents its military resistance against Russia as a defense of its sovereignty, independence, and democratic values. The Ukraine government, led by President Vladimir Zelensky, has consistently framed conflict as an unprovoked invasion, portraying Russia as an aggressor aiming to destroy Ukraine's identity and absorb the country into its sphere of influence. However, when examined critically, Ukraine's actions, decisions, and alignment with Western interests reveal serious miscalculations and self-inflicted sufferings upon its people. For instance, Ukraine's claim defending sovereignty against Russian aggression. Flawed argument. Ukraine's sovereignty was already compromised by the West. Ukraine asserts that it is defending its sovereignty, but in reality, its independence has already been compromised long before Russia's intervention. Since the 2014 Ukrainian coup, Ukraine has increasingly become a puppet state for Western interests, especially the United States and NATO. The 2014 coup was not natural democratic uprising, but a US-engineered regime change that replaced a democratically elected pro-Russian government with a pro-Western leadership hostile to Moscow. Ukraine's decision to seek NATO membership was not an independent policy choice but was heavily influenced by the West as a part of larger strategy to counter Russia. How Ukraine leadership betrayed its citizens. Now first, Zelensky was elected on platform of peace but instead intensified hostilities with Russia, ignoring the legitimate concern of Russian-speaking Ukrainians in Donbass. Rather than negotiating neutrality to ensure peace, Ukraine's government chose to escalate tensions under Western influence, pushing the nations to a devastating war. Now, what is the verdict? Ukraine is not fighting for true sovereignty but for Western geopolitical interest. Ukraine's claim Russia's actions are an unprovoked invasion. Flawed argument. Ukraine provoked the war by violating the agreements and attacking Donbass. Ukraine portrays Russia's military operation as unprovoked. But the reality is that Ukraine systematically violated agreements and engaged in aggression against its people at Donetsk and Luhansk. The Minsk Agreement 2014-2015 were meant to grant autonomy to Donbass, but Ukraine refused to implement them, continuing military attacks on these regions. Thousands of civilians in Donbass were killed between 2014 and 2022 due to Ukraine shelling, yet the West remained silent. Ukraine's military backed the Western arms, intensified hostilities instead of seeking peaceful resolution, leading to Russia's inevitable intervention. How Ukraine made its citizens suffer. Initially, the government's refusal to recognize Donbass autonomy meant years of civilian death, suffering, and economic collapse in the region. Instead of granting Russian-speaking Ukrainians equal rights, the government banned the Russian language and discriminated against ethnic Russians, creating internal divisions. Ukraine turned Donbass into a battleground, forcing its citizens into war zones while Western leaders used the conflict for their own geopolitical goals. In this verdict is, Russia did not start the war. Ukraine's refusal to honor agreements and its aggression in Donbass provoked the conflict. Thirdly, Ukraine's claim NATO membership would not threaten Russia. It is a flawed argument. Ukraine's NATO aspiration was a direct security threat. Ukraine claims that its NATO ambitions were peaceful, yet NATO's very existence is designed to counter Russia. By pushing for NATO's membership, Ukraine was provoking a security crisis that Moscow could not ignore. NATO expansion towards Russia's borders is a clear violation of previous Western assurance that NATO would not expand eastward. If Ukraine joined NATO, it would have allowed Western military bases, missile systems, and nuclear weapons on Russia's doorstep, an unacceptable security threat. The Cuban Missile Crisis 1962 proves that military action is inevitable when a superpower faces an existential threat near its border. How Ukrainian leader failed its people. Instead of maintaining neutrality and peace, Ukraine's government chose military confrontation. Ukraine leadership ignored Russia's warning for years, leading to a full-scale conflict that destroyed cities, displaced millions, and collapsed Ukraine's economy. In this verdict, Ukraine's NATO ambitions was reckless, serving Western interests at the cost of its people. In the fourth stage, if we analyze Ukraine's claim, the war is for democracy and freedom, flawed argument. Ukraine is not a true democracy but a Western-controlled state. Ukraine presents itself as a democratic state fighting for freedom. But in reality, Zelensky's government has engaged in authoritarian practices that contradict its claim. Banning opposition parties, Zelensky shut down pro-Russian political parties and media, suppressing dissent. Cracking down on free speech, Ukrainian journalists who criticized the war were arrested or silenced. Militarization of society. Ukraine forced civilians into conscription, forcing men to fight even if they opposed the war. How Ukraine government exploited its citizens. Ukrainians were not given a choice to seek peace. Zelensky forced the nation into prolonged conflict to satisfy Western military objectives. The war devastated Ukraine's economy, causing mass unemployment, poverty, and destruction. Millions of Ukrainians were displaced, turning them into refugees, while Western nations benefited from war profits. In this verdict is, Ukraine is not fighting for democracy but sacrificing its people for Western military and political gains. Ukraine's claim: the West is helping Ukraine win the war. Flawed argument: the West is using Ukraine as a proxy. Ukraine argues that US and NATO military aid is helping it win the war, but in reality, Western countries are benefiting while Ukraine is being destroyed. The US and Europe profit from arms sales while Ukrainians suffers on the battlefield. Western leaders refuse to send their troops, proving that Ukraine is just a proxy for their geopolitical war against Russia. Billions of Western aid go to military spending, but Ukrainian civilians face poverty, blackouts, and economic ruin. How Ukrainian government betrayed its people for Western interest. Instead of negotiating peace, Zelensky continues the war, sacrificing Ukrainian lives for NATO ambitions. Ukraine's leaders prioritize military aid over rebuilding the country, leading to a humanitarian crisis. While the Western leaders enjoy stability and economic growth, Ukrainians suffer and die on the front lines. In this, the verdict is that the West is not helping Ukraine but exploiting it for profit and power. In the final conclusions, Ukraine's leadership has failed its people. Ukraine's sovereignty was already compromised by Western interference, making its war claims hypocritical. Ukraine provoked the war by violating agreements, discriminating against its Russian-speaking population, and escalating tensions in Donbass. NATO's expansion was an existential threat to Russia, and Ukraine's pursuit of NATO membership made war inevitable. Zelensky's government is not democratic but authoritarian, suppressing dissent and forcing citizens into war. Western countries are using Ukraine as a proxy war zone, profiting from arms sales while Ukraine suffer and die. Who is truly suffering? The Ukrainian people. Millions have lost their homes, jobs, and loved ones due to their government's refusal to seek peace. The West profits from war, but Ukrainians are left to suffer under destruction and poverty. Zelensky is not a hero. He is a Western puppet who had led Ukrainian into destruction instead of peace. Ukrainian had the opportunity to remain neutral, respect the Minsk agreement and negotiate peace, but its leaders chose war over diplomacy, leading to the suffering of its citizens. The actual victims of the war are ordinary Ukrainians who their government betrayed. Evaluating the justification of Russia's military operation in Ukraine under international law. Russia has consistently maintained that its military actions in Ukraine are lawful, justified and necessary for its national security and the protection of ethnic Russians in Ukraine. While Western narratives portray the invasion as a violation of sovereignty, Russia argues that its intervention aligns with the self-defense principles, humanitarian intervention and historical rights. In this, the first one is legality under international law. Preemptive self-defense, Russia's argument. Preventing a security threat. Russia argues that its actions are a form of preemptive self-defense and a principle recognized under international law. How? The UN Charter, Article 51, allows nations to take defensive measures against imminent threats. The expansion of NATO towards Russia's border, despite previous assurances that NATO would not expand eastward, posed an existential threat to Russia's security. Russia also references precedents set by the US and NATO, such as a military intervention in Iraq, Kosovo and Libya, where preemptive action was taken in the name of security. If the West can justify military operations to neutralize perceived threats, Russia argues it has the same right to against Ukraine's militarization. Now the verdict, Russia's self-defense claim is valid. Russia acted under principles of anticipatory self-defense, which Western nations have used. Given the Ukrainians' increasing military cooperation with NATO, Russia had legitimate concerns that justified a military response. Secondly, historical and cultural claims. Ukraine has a part of Russian civilization. Russia's argument is that protecting the Russian world, Russia's assert that Ukraine has historically been an integral part of Russian civilization. The Kievan Rus, the birthplace of Russian culture, language and identity, was centered in modern-day Ukraine. Russia argues that Ukraine's shift towards the Western was engineered through Western-backed interventions, such as the 2014 Euromaidan coup, which overthrew a democratically elected pro-Russian government. Russia maintains that Ukraine's alignment with NATO and the EU was not a natural choice of the Ukrainian people, but rather a result of Western interference. The US and its allies have historically used Ukraine as a geopolitical tool to weaken Russia. In this, the verdict is that Russia has historical and cultural legitimacy. If historical claims are valid for Western nations in cases such as the Israel-Palestine, then Russia's assertion that Ukraine is historically connected to Russia should also be recognized. The forced separation of Ukraine from Russia was a geopolitical move, not a natural progression of history. Thirdly, security concerns. NATO expansion as an existential threat. Russia's argument is that NATO's broken promises. Russia argues that Western leaders in 1990 assurances that NATO would not expand eastward was bluntly violated. Over the decades, NATO expanded to include Poland and the Baltic states and the other Eastern European nations, increasing the military presence near Russia's border. Ukraine's intent to join NATO would allow Western military bases and missile systems within striking distance of Moscow. Russia treats this as a significant menace to its future and believes that Ukraine's neutrality is essential for regional security. In this, Russia's verdict is that Russian national security concerns are legitimate. The US has taken preemptive action when faced with similar security threat, example the Cuban Missiles crisis. Russia's intervention is no different in ensuring its strategic survival. Protection of Russian-speaking populations in Donbass. Russia's argument is that humanitarian justification since 2014, Russia-speaking population in Donetsk and Luhansk have faced systematic attacks from Ukrainian forces. Thousands of civilians have died due to military actions by Kyiv, which Russia considered ethnic persecution. The Minsk agreement meant to establish autonomy for these regions were never honored by Ukraine. Instead, Ukraine escalated military actions against Donbass. Russia argues that it was left with no choice but to recognize the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk and intervene to protect Russian-speaking civilians from genocide. In this verdict, Russia had the right to intervene to protect civilians under the responsibility to protect doctrine which the West has used for interventions in Libya, Syria and Kosovo. Russia's action in Donbass are justified. If Western nations can intervene under humanitarian grounds, Russia has the same right to protect Russian population in Ukraine. Now, economic and strategic interest. When we talk about this preventing Western economic dominance, Russia's argument is that defending economic sovereignty, Russia sees Ukraine alignment with the West as a part of larger economic war aimed at weakening Russia. The European Union and US sanctions restricted on Russia's energy exports and attempt to replace Russia's gas with alternative suppliers all indicate an effort to isolate Russia economically. Ukraine is rich in natural resources, agriculture and industry, making it strategically important. Russia would lose economic leverage in the region if Ukraine fell completely under Western influence. Russia ensures its long-term financial stability by securing Ukraine's key economic hubs. Russia is protecting its economic sovereignty. Economic wars are fought just as much as military wars. Russia is preventing the West from turning Ukraine into an anti-Russian economic outpost. The global perspective. Who benefits from the war? That is most significant one. The US and NATO have used the war to weaken Russia's economically and military while strengthening their control over Europe. The EU suffers from energy dependence and economic instability, which Russia argues is a Western sacrifice to maintain geopolitical dominance. Ukraine is being used as a proxy by Western powers with no discernible benefit except destruction and dependence on foreign aid. Russia argues further that the true aggressions are Western nations who are benefiting from arms sales, energy crisis and global instability while using Ukraine as a pawn. In this verdict, West is using Ukraine for geopolitical gain. The war served the interest of US hegemony, weakening Russia and increasing Western influence. Russia is countering this strategic attack, not acting as an aggressor. Hence, Russia's position is justified under international law. Russia's self-defense claim is valid under UN Charter Article 51 and international precedents. Russia has a historical and cultural right to defend its interests in Ukraine, much like Western nations defend their historical claims. Russia's security concerns regarding NATO expansions are legitimate and in the line with previous global security doctrines, example, US policy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Russia has the legitimacy to protect Russian-speaking populations under humanitarian intervention principles, much like NATO's interventions in Kosovo. The West has used Ukraine as a tool to provoke Russia, making Russia's actions a necessary response to Western aggression. In this context, Russia's military operation is not an unprovoked invention but a necessary strategic move to counter NATO's expansion, protect ethnic Russians and secure its national interest. As the sun sets on another day of unfolding geopolitics, BRICS TV Bharat remains committed to illuminating the path of truth and perspective. The quest for peace is never simple, but shaped by weight of history and present ambitions. While negotiations continue uncertainties remain, but so does the resilience of nations seeks a just order. Until next time, we leave you with the wisdom that understanding the first step towards resolution. This is BRICS TV Bharat, where perspectives unite and the world takes notice. Jai Hind.